Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, March 10th, 2025. All right, first thing, we are starting our fundraiser at antiwar.com, and we are trying to raise $100,000. That is our goal for this fundraiser. And as people know who read antiwar.com, who listen to this show, we are entirely reliant on our readers for funding. We have a very small staff. We have a very small budget for what we do, for the amount of content that we put out. And your money gets spent very efficiently. Everything you donate goes directly to running the site, paying our small staff, paying our contributors, and none of us take a big salary. There's not much money in the anti-war business, believe it or not. We don't get any kind of USAID money or anything like that. So please help us get off to a strong start here. Go to antiwar.com to see the different ways that you can support us if you appreciate this show. This is how it's done, through our readers supporting us. This is how we get by. So again, antiwar.com/donate. Help get us off to a strong start if you can. All right, so the first story, actually, I'm going to go down a little bit. I want to go to what the big news was over the weekend, which I'm sure most of you have heard about, is these horrific massacres in Syria. Over 1,000 killed as Syrian forces attack Alawites. So this article is from Jason Ditz. He did a good job covering this for us over the weekend. I mean, I couldn't believe how just horrific this became. So the situation in northwestern Syria continues to spiral out of control this weekend as the Islamist Hayat Tahrir al-Sham (HTS) has been surging forces into the Alawite homelands in the Latakia and Tartus governance, clashing with Alawite militias and slaughtering civilians. And this is on the west coast. The fighting erupted Thursday when the militias launched an organized attack on an HTS-run checkpoint near Jabla. It quickly escalated, and now the reported death tolls are enormous. The AP is reporting that over 600 killed, while newer reports are that over 1,300 deaths have occurred in the last 3 days. Currently, 125 militia fighters and 148 government forces loyal to HTS have been confirmed killed, though those numbers are expected to rise as the fighting continues. But you heard that number, over 1,300. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, at least 830 civilians have been killed. And these are executions, and the HTS, for those who don't know, HTS is the group that took over Syria after the regime change that ousted Assad, and it's an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. Its leader, Jilani, was the founder of Al-Qaeda in Syria, and he's rebranded, but there's many, this is the kind of group that they are. I feared, a lot of us feared the worst when HTS took over, and there was some calm for a little while, but things have just exploded. And now, so I mentioned that this started with these militias attacking HTS, but as we covered at antiwar.com, which got very little attention, there have been executions of Alawites in this area by HTS affiliated fighters happening since the regime change, and that context is just completely missing from any of the mainstream coverage. I mean, even if you read it, they make it sound like it's mostly just fighting, like these civilians that were just killed in like crossfire or something. But these HTS, these guys, they put these videos on Telegram, and there's just been horrific footage coming out. I've seen them making like men crawl and bark, and then they shoot them, and videos of them beating people, just really horrific stuff. The majority of the deaths, potentially the vast majority, are Alawite civilians, as HTS forces from the Defense Ministry and Interior Ministry have been carrying out revenge killings en masse in several locations. Early reports of summary executions of Alawites were in the area around Jabla, as well as the village of Al-Muqtaraya, Al-Shir, and Al-Hafa. Since then, reports have HTS troops rounding up men in cities like Baniyaz, killing them by the scores. Alawites are being dragged from their shops and shot in the streets. There have also been reports of security forces looting homes and businesses and setting fires. Most of the slain civilians are believed to be adult men, but a number of women and children have been confirmed executed as well. 13 women and 5 children were reported killed in Bania, while Saturday morning an additional 4 women and 9 children were among those buried in the village of Tuwam in the Hama governorate. From a military control perspective, it has been reported that HTS forces have effective control over the cities of Tartus, Latakia, Jabla, and Banias, though some fighting is still going on in the area. And the narrative, as Jason says, and this is coming from Syrian state media, which is now controlled by HTS, of course. The narrative is that these Alawite militias are remnants of the former Assad government, who the HTS ousted. Reports from state media are also playing up the idea that the civilians are Assad loyalists. And we see this not just from the state media in Syria, but from the mainstream media in the West, calling these people Assad loyalists. And as Jason says, some of the military may hold loyalty to former Assad-era Major General Sual al-Hassan, which he leads one of these militias. But the claim of the hundreds of civilians being loyalists is just not credible. And the executions, the indications are that the executions really don't have anything to do with that. It's just the fact that they're Alawites, the Alawite minority. They're being persecuted by these HTS fighters. And as Jason mentions, as I mentioned, the HTS government started carrying out violent crackdowns against the Alawite minority almost immediately after taking power, and it has always been presented as either targeting Assad remnants or drug smugglers. Alawites have been sounding the alarm about their persecution for months, noting that while Assad and some of his circle were Alawites, the ordinary Alawite in the northwest faced every bit as much persecution under the old regime as the rest of the country had. And local sources say, people on the ground in Syria say that most of the perpetrators of the massacres of civilians were foreign militants, including Uyghurs, Chechens, and Uzbeks, and only a small percentage were Syrians. And following the downfall of Assad, the HTS-led government absorbed foreign jihadists into its military and appointed some to senior roles. So Jason has a lot of information here and, kind of the background of HTS. And Ahmad al-Shara, this is a horrific picture. These are bodies being moved with bulldozers in western Syria. And so Jilani, the leader of HTS was always known as Muhammad al-Jilani. Now he goes by Ahmad al-Shara, which is apparently his real name. And he's been demanding the Alawites surrender. And, now his government is claiming, that they're looking into some of these stories about massacres. But he also said that the fighting against his security forces was an unforgivable mistake. And he gave an address on Friday reiterating his intention to monopolize weapons in the hand of the state. This is just horrific. And it looks like for now, there's still shelling and stuff happening, but the really bad massacres at least seem to have slowed down a little bit. But like Friday and Saturday, it just seemed like it was just open season and just really horrific. Again, some of those videos. This is who the U.S. helped put in power. I covered this story a few weeks after the regime change that revealed that the U.S. got one of its proxies, a militia based at a U.S. base in southern Syria, to join in on the HTS offensive and help coordinate. And of course, the U.S. support for groups like HTS in Syria goes back years and years. But when it comes to the offensive that actually ousted Assad, the U.S. was supportive of it. Turkey was basically running it, basically gave them the green light. Israel, of course, was helping with airstrikes and took credit for the regime change, and now has invaded Syria and is taking territory. And I think we're just going to see Israel take advantage of this and say, look at this government that's in Syria. That this is why we have to hold this territory in Syria. They're going to use this to justify taking more territory. And, Syria is probably just going to get carved up between Turkey, Syria, and Israel, and who knows what's going to happen with the Kurds in the east. So the whole situation is just a mess. And the next one here, another one from Jason, 10,000 Syrian Alawites flee into northern Lebanon after massacres. So there were hopes in Lebanon that the restoration of calm after the regime change in Syria would mean that the large number of Syrian refugees living in Lebanon would return home. And that did start to happen to some extent, but now there's a big influx of refugees from Syria. And amid the massacres of Alawite civilians in northwest Syria, in Tartus and Latakia. Many thousands, the reports say over 10,000, are fleeing into North Lebanon, which is where there is an Alawite community as well. Also, Christians, there's been reports of Christians being massacred, and Christians are fleeing, and the Christian leaders in Syria are calling for help and an end to the slaughter. So it's just, again, this is the stuff that we feared with HTS taking over, with Al-Qaeda essentially taking over Syria, and now it's all coming to fruition here. All right, so the next one. So now going to get into some Israel-Gaza stuff. Israel cuts all electricity to Gaza. So Israel on Sunday said that it was cutting off electricity to the Gaza Strip as it ramps up the collective punishment of the civilian population to pressure Hamas to release Israeli hostages, violating the ceasefire deal reached in January. So Israeli Energy Minister Eli Cohen made the announcement, saying that he instructed the Israel Electric Corporation to immediately stop selling electricity to power stations in Gaza. Cohen said, quote, "We will employ all the tools available to us so that all the hostages will return, and we will ensure that Hamas won't be in Gaza on the day after," end quote. So this move is expected to impact Gaza's water supply, since electricity powers desalination plants that produce drinking water. And this is just adding, again, to this collective punishment of the civilian population of Gaza. And since March 2nd, Israel has blocked the entry of aid, medicine, fuel, and all other goods into Gaza, which is a clear war crime that's been backed by the U.S. The UN's World Food Program has warned that it's running out of food supplies in Gaza, and Palestinians report a sharp rise in prices since Israel imposed the total siege. You see children here who just got, these are children in Gaza who just collected food from a charity kitchen. And the World Food Program, which is supplying food for a lot of these charities, for a lot of the places where they can go get a meal, a free meal. They say they're running out, that they only have, at this point, 10 days worth of food left. And Israel's demanding that Hamas release more Israeli hostages, but without a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza or commitment to a permanent ceasefire, which were both conditions of the second phase of the initial deal. Hamas continues to call for the implementation of the second phase, saying it will not release the remaining hostages without an Israeli commitment to end the genocidal war permanently. The Wall Street Journal reported on Friday that Israel is planning a series of escalatory steps that could lead to the full-scale resumption of the bombing. The report said that after cutting all aid to Gaza, the next step was cutting off electricity and water. After that, if Hamas does not agree to Israel's terms, airstrikes could resume. And at a higher level, we have seen airstrikes in Gaza, but to the level that they were before the ceasefire. And then the idea would be for the mass displacement of Palestinians in North Gaza and another Israeli invasion, basically, to go back into the territory that they controlled. So this report from the Wall Street Journal said that an Israeli invasion of the territories it withdrew from in Gaza seems inevitable. Although Adam Boehler, who's Trump's envoy for hostages, he seems to think that a deal could happen, and we'll get more into that in this next story. So Envoy defends talks with Hamas, says that the U.S. is not an agent of Israel. So on Sunday, Adam Boehler, President Trump's special envoy for hostages, defended his direct talks with Hamas in the face of Israeli objections, saying the U.S. is not an agent of Israel. Israeli media has reported that Israel expressed strong objections to the talks once it learned about them. According to the Times of Israel, Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs Ron Dermer lashed out at Boehler in a phone call. So Boehler told CNN host Jake Tapper, quote, "I spoke with Ron, and I'm sympathetic. He has someone that he doesn't know well making direct contact with Hamas. Maybe I would see them and say, look, they don't have horns growing out of their head. They're actually guys like us. They're pretty nice guys. So he doesn't know me, and there are big stakes. He lives in a country where if it sets certain precedents, then it will hurt or help a lot of other people. So I understand the consternation and the concern. And I wasn't upset. At the same time, we're the United States. We're not an agent of Israel. We have specific interests at play," end quote. So Axios reporter Barak Ravid, who's a former IDF intelligence officer, was the first to report on the U.S.-Hamas talks, and his report said that the U.S. did not fully brief Israel on the talks and that Israel learned about them through other channels. And so apparently they did have an argument about this. And So Bowler, one thing I learned about him today is that he was college roommates of Jared Kushner. He's Jared Kushner's college roommate, and he was involved in the first administration with, I think, some stuff with the Abraham Accords and some COVID stuff as well. And he also said, the talks are focused on Edon Alexander, who's a 21-year-old IDF soldier who grew up in New Jersey, so he has American citizenship. And he's the only one with U.S. citizenship believed to be alive. There's also 4 bodies of dual U.S.-Israeli citizens there. But Bowler's also saying that he thinks a long-term deal could happen. He said, quote, "With respect to the Hamas situation, I do think there's hope. I think that Israel has done a wonderful, masterful job eliminating Hamas, Hezbollah, and a number of enemies in the state that makes things impossible that weren't possible before. And I think you could see something like a long-term truce where we forgive prisoners, where Hamas lays down their arms, where they agree they're not part of the political party going forward," end quote. So Israel hasn't eliminated Hamas, first of all, and Hamas's stance has been that they don't need to govern a post-war Gaza, saying that they don't need to be involved in that, but they are saying that they would only disarm if there was a sufficient alternative Palestinian armed group under a Palestinian state. So basically, they're saying they would only dismantle their military wing if there is a Palestinian state. And of course, that's something Israel, especially this current government, is completely against and will not agree to. All right, so the next one here, Israeli intelligence says Netanyahu policies led to Hamas October 7th attack. This one is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So the Israeli Shin Bet intel agency concluded that policies of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu led to Hamas's attack on October 7th. The report released last week explained that Netanyahu allowed Qatar to send funds to Hamas, and that propped up the Palestinian group and paved the way for October 7th. It explained that Netanyahu's, quote, policy of quiet that allowed Hamas's massive buildup, the flow of Qatari funds, and their delivery to Hamas's military win, and the ongoing erosion of Israeli deterrence, and, quote, the longtime Israeli prime minister has believed that propping up Hamas in Gaza was key to never having to negotiate a two-state solution by keeping the Palestinians in the Strip and the West Bank separated. The idea, and we've seen this spelled out by Israeli officials, saying that, the Palestinian Authority, the Hamas is an asset. This is something Smotrich actually said, that Hamas is an asset and the PA is a liability because nobody's going to give Hamas a seat at the UN, but the PA, is more likely to get international recognition. All right, so the next one here, Israeli Migration Administration to facilitate ethnic cleansing. This article is from The Cradle. So Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich said on March 9th that the government would establish a migration administration to facilitate the expulsion of Palestinians from their homes and lands in the Gaza Strip. He said, quote, "We are establishing a migration administration. We are preparing for this under the leadership of the Prime Minister and Defense Minister. The budget will not be an obstacle," end quote. Since the beginning of Israel's genocide of Palestinians in Gaza in October 2023, Israeli leaders have discussed schemes to ethnically cleanse Gaza and replace the indigenous Palestinian population with Jewish settlers. The Israeli military has made Gaza nearly uninhabitable after a year of relentless airstrikes. And Trump recently repackaged Israel's plans to forcibly expel Gazans. And I mean, that's a good way to put it. That everybody says, "Oh, this Trump's got this big new idea that nobody's ever heard of before." Well, the Israelis have been wanting to do this, to expel the Palestinians from Gaza for a long time now. Smotrich said on Sunday, quote, "The plan is taking shape with ongoing actions in coordination with the U.S. administration," end quote. And of course, I mean, I guess the new thing is Trump saying that the U.S. would take it over, but I don't think that would actually happen if the ethnic cleansing happened. I think that's really the goal. Just let Israel take it over. Smotrich claimed that sources in the American government agreed that it's impossible for 2 million people with hatred toward Israel to remain at a stone's throw from the border. Israel's war on Gaza has killed well over 50,000 Palestinians, the majority women and children. The new migration administration would be up under the Israeli Ministry of Defense with the goal of expelling all Palestinians as quickly as logistics allow. He said, quote, "If we remove 5,000 a day, it will take a year. This is a huge logistical operation, not just the bus that takes them. We need to know who is going to which country, what ages, vocational training, a huge operation we are preparing. This has the potential to create a historic change in the Middle East and for the people, for the state of Israel," end quote. So, I mean, this is, he was just in D.C. speaking with U.S. officials. He says he's got U.S. officials on his side. And Smotrich is so, sometimes, even though he's in the government, I'll see a headline about something he said. I say, oh, that's just Smotrich. He's just some crazy guy and, some crazy Israeli guy. But no, he's in a very powerful and influential position in the current Israeli government. And it's just horrific, the fact that he gets this warm welcome visiting D.C. All right, the next one here. Yemen's Houthis give Israel a deadline on Gaza aid. So the leader of Yemen's Houthis has given Israel a deadline to lift its blockade on Gaza, warning that Yemeni naval operations against Israel could restart. So Abdul Malik al-Houthi issued the ultimatum on Friday, suggesting Houthi attacks on Israel-linked shipping could start on Tuesday. He said, quote, "We meet a siege with a siege. Yemen cannot stand by and watch the Israeli enemy's aggressive approach in starving the Palestinian people in Gaza," end quote. So the Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, ceased their attacks on Israel and Red Sea shipping after the Gaza and ceasefire deal was reached, but had vowed to intervene if Israel violated the agreement. So, if this starts again, there's a very good chance of the U.S. bombing Yemen, because the U.S. intervened to protect Israeli shipping and bombed the Houthis for a year. And, it didn't do anything. It just escalated the situation. I mean, it didn't do anything to stop the attacks. Situation only escalated. The Houthis were essentially asking for it, trying to provoke the U.S. into bombing them. And so, when it comes to what's happening in Gaza, the whole region could explode again, because Israel is imposing this complete blockade, and there's a chance that the really heavy bombing could restart again at any time, really. All right, so the next one here, Israel launches largest attack on South Lebanon since ceasefire. So this is another one from Jason. This got barely any attention over the weekend, it seemed like. In the largest series of attacks against Lebanon since the November ceasefire, Israel has carried out dozens of airstrikes against areas around the border in southern Lebanon. Nearly 30 airstrikes have been confirmed. Casualty figures are still not confirmed, but one civilian was killed and another was wounded in a drone strike against a car in the town of Kirbet Selm. 3 civilians were also shot in the border village of Kfar Kela by Israeli troops firing across the border. Several towns and villages along the border reported airstrikes on the outskirts of the area, though many of them targeted uninhabited areas. Israel claims that they were targeting terrorist infrastructure that they believe Hezbollah was trying to reconstruct. Since it was outside of the towns, the strikes were carried out overnight. It's possible that nobody was present at many of the sites, so the casualty figures may be surprisingly low given the scope of the attack. So even though it seems like they launched heavy airstrikes, it looks like they bombed a lot of empty, uninhabited areas. So again, as things stand, Israel continues to occupy these 5 outposts that it built in southern Lebanon in violation of the ceasefire deal with Hezbollah. Still haven't seen any attacks from Hezbollah on Israel or the Israeli troops occupying southern Lebanon. All right, so the next one here, Iranian leader rejects talks with the U.S. So Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has again rejected the idea of talks with the U.S. in the face of increasing sanctions, and these comments came after President Trump said that he had tried to contact the Iranian leader. In his remarks on Saturday, Khamenei did not name the U.S. directly, but referred to it as a bully government. He said, quote, "Some bully governments, I really don't know of any more appropriate term for some foreign figures and leaders than the word bullying, insist on their negotiations. Their negotiations are not aimed at solving problems. They aim at domination," end quote. So on Friday, Trump said that he sent a letter to Khamenei saying that he wanted a deal. But Iran's foreign minister said that Tehran has yet to receive it. Trump also hinted at potential military action against Iran if a deal is not reached. Trump said, quote, "Something is going to happen one way or the other. I hope that Iran," and I've written them a letter saying, "I hope you're going to negotiate, because if we have to go in militarily, it's going to be a terrible thing for them," end quote. So basically doing the same thing he did during the first administration, increasing sanctions, making military threats, and just doesn't seem like it's gonna go anywhere toward a deal or toward real diplomacy. All right, so the next one here, Qatar calls for Israel's nuclear facilities to be brought under the IAEA. So Qatar, a lot of people say Qatar. I always say Qatar. I know Scott always says Qatar, Scott Horton. I wonder, but some people feel strongly about Qatar or Qatar. And basically from my research is I've determined that both are okay. So Qatar has renewed its calls for Israel's nuclear facility to be brought under the supervision of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, and for Israel to join the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear state, which would require Israel to abolish its nuclear stockpile. Israel has a covert nuclear weapons program that it does not officially acknowledge and is estimated to have somewhere between 90 and 300 warheads. Qatar's foreign ministry said that Doha's ambassador to the UN in Vienna, Jassim Yaqub al-Hamadi, made a statement concerning Israel's nuclear program during a meeting of the IAEA's Board of Governors. The foreign ministry said, quote, Hamadi underscored the need for the international community and its institutions to uphold their commitments under resolutions of the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, the IAEA, and the 1995 Review Conference of the NPT, which called on Israel to subject all of its facilities to IAEA safeguards, end quote. So, the reason why I want to highlight this is just he's saying this at the IAEA Board of Governors, which is kind of it's the member states to the IAEA. They meet there and they do, I don't know, how much they really do, but every once in a while they pass a resolution condemning Iran for their nuclear program, even though Iran's nuclear program is subject to IAEA inspections, and Iran is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And even though everybody's freaking out about their enrichment levels, there's still no evidence that they're trying to make a nuclear bomb. Israel, on the other hand, has a nuclear weapons program that's not subject to IAEA inspections. They have nuclear weapons that they don't officially acknowledge, yet the IAEA, the Board of Governors, never seems to condemn them. And this is because the U.S. also does not officially recognize Israel's nuclear weapons program, does not acknowledge its existence, and does not put pressure on Israel to sign the NPT. And one reason for that is because there are foreign assistance laws, the Symington Amendment to one foreign assistance law that prohibits military aid to a nuclear armed state that does not sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that was added in the 1970s by two U.S. senators who were unhappy about the lack of action or consequences for Israel getting nuclear weapons. And I linked to a good article there from Grant Smith, who's really good on all this stuff about how Israel's nukes make U.S. aid illegal. It was the senators, again, after Israel diverted enough U.S. weapons-grade uranium from the government contractor NUMEC to build a dozen bombs, and U.S. Senators Stuart Symington and John Glenn were outraged that nothing was being done, and then they added this amendment to the law. And that's really, I think, why, and that's what Grant Smith and others think, why the U.S. goes along with this game, kind of pretending Israel's nukes don't exist, is because they want to make sure they could keep giving them military aid. All right, so the next one here, Trump wants Ukraine elections to restart aid. So the Trump administration wants Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to move his country toward elections or consider stepping down as one of the requirements for the U.S. to resume military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. This was reported by NBC News on Sunday, and the report cited U.S. officials who said the administration also wants to see a change in Zelensky's attitude toward peace and the possibility of ceding territory. And they also want the minerals deal that would give the U.S. a piece of Ukraine's rare earth minerals and other natural resources, oil and gas. But the election thing, I think, is interesting because, we've really seen a lot of talk about this. And it looks like, I think, the Trump administration thinks that Zelensky's an impediment to peace. The report doesn't just say that they want to move toward elections. It's a move toward elections or potentially Zelensky stepping down. So I think they want Zelensky out of there. Their U.S. and Ukrainian officials are meeting in Saudi Arabia on Thursday. on Tuesday, and they're expected to discuss all this stuff. But for now, as far as we know, the U.S. weapon shipments and the intelligence sharing, I'm sure there's still some intelligence stuff happening. That is still paused. Russia launched some pretty heavy missile and drone attacks on Ukraine over the weekend. It was really on Friday, I think, were the heaviest ones. In response to that, Trump threatened additional sanctions on Russia and threatened tariffs on Russia. So I don't know. Hopefully they get moving along on this peace deal to end this thing. And, more sanctions is obviously not going to be the solution there. All right, so the last story here, DHS arrests student activist for Gaza protests. So this article is from Dropsite News, and this is a really just kind of chilling story here. So on Saturday night, Department of Homeland Security, DHS agents entered a student residential building at Columbia University in Uptown New York and detained Mahmoud Khalil, one of the lead negotiators on behalf of pro-Palestine protesters at 2024's Gaza Solidarity Encampment. In a sweeping attack on the First Amendment, the Trump administration said this week that it would begin revoking visas of Hamas sympathizers, specifically citing Columbia University students. The detention followed a 2-day targeted online campaign against Khalil by pro-Israel groups and individuals, including Columbia's high-profile pro-Israel professor Shai Davidai. So Khalil, an Algerian citizen of Palestinian origin and an American green card holder, was detained by DHS officials around 8:30 as he was entering the Columbia residential building he lives in. He was returning from an iftar, breaking the day-long fast observed by many Muslims during the month of Ramadan. Khalil's wife, who was 8 months pregnant, was with him at the time. A statement by the pro-Palestine group Writers Against the War on Gaza stated that he was abducted and detained without the physical demonstration of a warrant or officially filed charges. Khalil was detained at a DHS facility in New Jersey, according to a database for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. But when his wife went to try and visit him, she was informed that he was not there. And his attorney confirmed that he's not at the ICE facility in New Jersey, and they don't know where he is. According to the organization, the DHS agents told Khalil that the U.S. Department of State had revoked his student visa. The group said that was despite the fact that he had a green card, not a visa. And that means he's a permanent resident. And in response to a request for comment from Dropsite, the DHS said that you needed to reach out to the White House. But essentially what happened was that they went to arrest him and they said, we're going to revoke your visa. And he said, well, I have a green card. And they said, well, we're going to revoke that too. And Marco Rubio tweeted out on Sunday night a story from AP about this and saying, if you attend pro-Hamas or, if you're pro-Hamas or whatever, I forget exactly how he worded it, but we're going to revoke your visa or green card. And green card is just a whole nother kind of level, a whole nother crackdown. And again, there's no evidence here that, as far as I know, that this guy was involved in any kind of violent protests. He was the reason why he was targeted was because his name and identity was known because he acted as a negotiator representing the students and negotiated with the university. And I mean, the precedent that is being set here, if people don't think that this stuff isn't going to happen to Americans, I mean, I think they're incredibly foolish. You think about the Patriot Act and just all, what direction do these things go in? And it's a very, very broad brush. They label anybody pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas, anybody who's against what Israel's doing, they label them pro-Hamas. So this is very bad. And another thing, this mentions that Columbia, the Trump administration, took away $400 million in funding to Columbia, which is a lot of money. And Columbia, the tuition is like huge. But anyway, this is a First Amendment violation, and people will roll their eyes and say, oh, well, the universities, especially a private university, shouldn't get federal funding. But, I quoted Glenn Greenwald in an article about this. He's a constitutional lawyer. Under the First Amendment, if a government is going to give away a benefit, and then they cannot, if the government's going to do that, they can't withhold it or take it away over certain political views. And the fact is, Columbia is cracking down on these protesters. They suspended 3 people from one of their schools And they're really cracking down on these protests. So I don't know what, it seems like the Trump administration is really eager to do this. And it's just not a good sign. All right, so that is it for the news for today. So please go check out our viewpoints. One from Ted Snyder, pausing aid to Ukraine. The world should have seen it coming. One from Dan Steinbach, was October 7th avoidable? One from Ramsey Baroud, the lost Arab, Gaza, and the evolving language of the Palestinian struggle. One from Paul R. Pillar, Gaza ceasefire hits the brick wall of Netanyahu's agenda. And one from Connor O'Keefe, the other thing Zelensky got called out on, talking about conscription in Ukraine. Please go check all that out. Again, help us out with our fundraiser if you can, antiwar.com/donate. Other ways you could support us is just sharing the show, telling your friends, getting the word out about antiwar.com and what we do. Follow us on all the social media, Instagram, X, and TikTok. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.